Hi everyone, so today we're making rigatoni alla bolognese. This is a delicious baked dish that we can use in our Marra Forni ovens. We're doing 3 top Italian recipes because not only are we making this, but we're also making the bolognese sauce and the Besciamella sauce that are going to be used in the recipe. You know, everybody knows us for our pizza ovens, and pizza is the most known Italian food in the world, but right after that comes pasta, and we love to bake the pasta in these ovens, so check out the recipe. So now we're going to make our ragù alla bolognese, aka bolognese sauce, or sugo di carne, as some people say in Italian, and it's our wonderful slow-cooked meat sauce that we can use on pasta or in the recipe that we're making today. So the first thing is I'm going to make sure that my heat is at about medium to medium low, and then I'm going to add in a combination of olive oil and butter. So I've got extra virgin olive oil here, and I'm going to add the butter in at the same time because we want to get these melted together. Everything will be really nice and golden. It's going to give our sauce both flavor and a little bit more fat, and it's going to allow the meat to brown really well. So we always want to make sure that we have both to start this recipe. You know, this particular recipe hails from Bologna, so they're using a lot of milk and a lot of dairy products, but of course in the Italian tradition, the olive oil is always really good too. And a lot of people are confused about what makes a ragù and what makes a different type of a meat sauce. You know, what is the difference between a traditional ragù or a traditional bolognese sauce? So normally, if you just hear the word ragù alone, many people are talking about the Neapolitan version of a ragù, which was made with whole pieces of meat and not ground meat. But this is the Bolognese version. They call it ragù alla bolognese. So we use ground meat in this version. And of course, some people don't know that, and so you might go to a restaurant or go to a different location and it could be called just ragù, and it's really the ragù alla bolognese, or vice versa. We find there's a lot of confusion about those terms, but normally whole chunks, just plain ragù, and if it's ground meat, it's bolognese sauce or ragù alla bolognese. So now that our oil and butter have melted and everything's come together and is nice and golden, we can add our vegetables. I've got equal parts onion, celery, and carrot. A lot of chefs know this is a mirepoix. In Italian, we call it a soffritto, and it's the base of a lot of recipes. Sauces, soups, stocks. You always have in your pantry, in an Italian kitchen, these 3 ingredients. They're called the Holy Trinity. So onion, carrot, and celery, they're in a lot of recipes. And they add a lot of hidden flavor, but also nutrition, right? Because the onion gives us that nice deep flavor, the carrot gives a little bit of sweetness to your sauce, and the celery just kind of gives a little bit of crispiness and green. So I'm just gonna add my ground meat. And you can use whatever kind of meat you like. I'm using beef today. Some people use a combination of beef and pork. Sometimes I do other things like veal or goat meat. It's really, you know, whatever you like and whatever you've got on hand. I like to get a nice, good quality meat because it really is the protagonist in this recipe. And you're also going to want to make sure that the meat has a significant amount of fat in it. So this is not the time when you're going to want to do a recipe that has low fat content, you know, fat-free or like 95%, 97%. That's for a different recipe. In this sauce, you want to have some of the fat because it's going to give you a lot of the flavor. And traditionally, this sauce was eaten on Sundays. So it's not something that you're going to eat every day. You're just going to eat it as a splurge or kind of once in a while. So I'm just going to stir everything around, make sure that all of that wonderful oil and all of the butter is incorporated in with my meat. And I'm kind of breaking up with a spoon as I go because I don't want any big chunks. I want to make sure that all of the meat gets brown, and I want to make sure also that it gets all of that wonderful flavor in everything. And this takes a minute. You know, some people like to throw everything in one pot all at one time and then just go like a slow cooker or something. You could do the slow cooker later, but right now these initial steps are really building the flavor. And that's what we find a lot in the Italian kitchen. You know, you can't take shortcuts. It's not complicated, it's not difficult in terms of technique, but you have to let everything really have the time to develop the flavors at each step of the process. So now that our meat is nice and brown, it's time to add the salt and pepper. And I just start off with a little bit because you're never sure how much salt is going to be in your tomatoes. And a healthy dose of black pepper. Give that a stir. And now we can deglaze with a cup of wine. So you just want to use any white wine that you have on hand, something that may be left over from drinking or from another day. About a cup is good. And I'm going to turn our temperature up. And what I want to happen now is to make sure that all of the wine evaporates into this meat. It's going to give us a lot of flavor and a nice tender texture. It's really traditional in the Bolognese recipe to make sure that you have something before you add the stock and the tomatoes, some kind of acidic liquid. So if you're not drinking or you're not using wine in your recipes, you could even use a little bit of balsamic vinegar, a good quality balsamic, diluted in some water. So maybe put like a quarter cup of balsamic vinegar with half a cup of water and mix it together and use that in this stage. And that way it's non-alcoholic, but you still get a lot of nice flavor in your recipe. But white wine is the traditional ingredient to add. So now I'm just stirring it up, making sure that everything gets evaporated. And you can tell, because what's going to happen at the bottom of the pot is as you stir, you're going to start to see more of the surface area, less liquid. And that's how you know when this is working. So at this point, one of the things that I like to talk about with my students is the size of the pot. Because it makes a really big difference in cooking sauces. And a lot of people don't realize that, and they'll just use whatever pot they've got on hand. And that's fine, you can work with it. But if you want to make the right sauce and you want to have it come out without a lot of guesswork, the easiest way is to have the right pot. So this is a sauce pot, right? Because it's large, it's got a nice surface area, but it's also very high. And a lot of people don't realize if you have a very short, kind of a shallow pot, that's going to cook things much quicker. So like if you have a sauce and the pot is very wide, but it's only about this high, your sauce will cook much more quickly than it does in this time. So the next time you're going to make a traditional sauce, always look for a pot like this that's wide enough at the bottom, but also is nice and high. And if not, keep in mind that it might eat up some of your liquid a little bit more quickly. So you might want to add more liquid if you're using a shorter, wider pot. So now that our wine's evaporated, it's time to add the other liquids in. So we're going to add about 4 cups of our tomato puree, or if you have crushed tomatoes, you can use those, or you can kind of use the whole San Marzano tomatoes and just crush them in your hands really well, whichever you prefer. In Italian, this is called passata, and a lot of people make their own at the end of the summer when the tomatoes are in season, and that way you have delicious tomatoes all year long. So we're going to add those. And then we're going to add our beef stock. You can use whatever type of stock you like, vegetable, chicken, but it's just another layer of flavor in this recipe. And it makes a much richer sauce than if you only use tomatoes. So that's just a little trick. So I'm going to let this come up to a full boil, and then we'll reduce the heat to low, cover it, let it simmer for anywhere between 2 and 3 hours. And what we'll do is every 30 minutes, we'll just come in and stir it, make sure that everything is coming together properly, that we don't need to add any other liquid. Normally you don't, but it's always good to double check. Okay, so now we're ready to start making our Besciamella or bechamel sauce. And in a minute, I'm going to tell you what the difference between those two words is. But to get started, let's make our roux. So our roux is going to be the mixture of butter and flour, and that's what we use to make this classic sauce. It's going to be our thickener and really help to give the sauce its body. So I'm getting my butter in and starting to melt that. And then I'm going to add my flour. And we'll just come in and stir them together. And it's amazing how fast everything starts to come together once it melts. And this is a really important step for a thickener. A lot of people just add the flour in by itself, but that of course doesn't do the trick. And if you don't cook at this step enough, so this is really critical at this point. So once our roux starts to come together and it gets a little bit thick, it looks almost like Play-Doh, I want to stir it around a little bit. And the reason I'm spending some time at this step is because if you just go straight in with your liquid and add the milk, it's going to taste a little bit raw. and you've all had that kind of white cream sauce that had a floury type taste to it. We don't want that in this. We want this to be really velvety and rich. Of course, you could let it go darker and your sauce would be darker too. But for this recipe, we want to keep it a little bit golden. So now that we've cooked our flour, I'm going to go ahead and add the milk in. And the milk should be slightly warmed. So now that all of our milk is incorporated, I'm just going to whisk and make sure that all the lumps get kind of broken up and everything becomes homogeneous, because what will happen now is all of that flour is going to help the milk to really solidify and help it to get a lot thicker and turn it into that creamy-like consistency that we're looking for. So I just continue to whisk, and I make sure each time as I go around that I'm grabbing whatever is clinging to the sides of the pan, because that's the good stuff. Along the sides of the pan, you know, that surface area kind of starts to caramelize a little bit before the rest of the recipe cooks. So if I can come through and grab that, my sauce is going to be just a little bit sweeter and a little bit better. So that's a little tip. I'm going to add my black pepper. And something else that's very traditional in the Italian version of a Besciamella sauce is freshly grated nutmeg. So this is our little nutmeg berry. You can buy it, of course, already ground, but it has a lot of volatile oils, so it starts to kind of lose its aroma if you buy it already pre-ground. So we like to grate it fresh for the same reason as you would grate black pepper. And so I'm just going to turn this little nutmeg pod right around and make sure that I can extract as much flavor from that as possible. And nutmeg is pretty heavily used in Italian cooking. It's not something that you would generally associate with it, but we do add it in just here and there, enough to give the recipes a little bit of backbone and a little bit of flavor. So now I'm going to continue to whisk, and I'll add in a little bit of salt, remember, because there's no salt in the sauce at all. So you want to make sure and add that. And then at the end, I'm going to add some bay leaf for additional flavor. And it's already starting to thicken, but I'm just going to let it continue to cook, and I'll kind of very slowly whisk because I'm not trying to create any kind of froth or foam. I'm only whisking, or I could actually be using the wooden spoon at this time too. I'm only doing this just so that my sauce thickens and comes together. And it usually takes a couple minutes depending upon the amount of sauce that you have. And while it's thickening up, I'll tell you the story about the history of the salsa besciamella or bechamel sauce. Most of the world knows bechamel sauce as a French sauce. It's used in Greek cooking, it's used in European cooking, Middle Eastern cooking. Almost everybody has a recipe that incorporates a bechamel sauce. And if you like to make homemade chowders or velvety soups, homemade macaroni and cheese, you're very familiar with the bechamel sauce, right? Because all you have to do to make macaroni and cheese is throw a handful of your favorite cheeses in there and then toss your pasta with it, bake it, and you've got a nice, good homemade macaroni and cheese. But this sauce was actually introduced to the French by the Florentines. So Catherine de' Medici, who later became the Queen of France when she married the King of France, she brought this sauce and many other Florentine that are now considered to be Italian recipes with her to the courts. So duck à l'orange, you know, the duck and orange sauce, gelatos and ice creams, many different pastry recipes, crepes, which are called crespelle in Italian, and the salsa besciamella, which became the bechamel sauce in France. And many modern French chefs actually attribute that to the birth of the Grande Cuisine in Paris. But of course, we still have the bechamel sauce also in Italy, and it's used extensively in the Bologna region. So for example, when you have the classic Bolognese style lasagna, they don't make it with ricotta cheese and the way that Americans make lasagna. They make it with Bolognese sauce, and they make it with the Besciamella sauce. Those are the two classic ingredients for that particular recipe for lasagna. And now my sauce is kind of starting to thicken up a little bit, so I'm going to just reduce the heat. But you know, you don't have to make a very elaborate recipe with the Besciamella. If I had this, I could also use this with any pasta that I wanted. Just toss the cooked, very al dente pasta with the Besciamella sauce, add a handful of my favorite cooked, roasted, grilled vegetables, some cheese, put it in a nice pan, put it in the oven, and you've got a wonderful baked pasta dish. In the fall time, I love to do this with pumpkin. It's very traditional. Pumpkin or squash, but you could really do whatever you wanted. It's a nice hearty recipe for the fall. Now I'm going to switch over to my whisk, because basically what I'm doing here is just allowing this to thicken up a little bit. And I'm going to turn my flame down because we don't want this to be boiling too high or definitely boiling over. We just want it to get a little bit of thickness or a little bit of body into this sauce. And I can tell already it's coming up to the right temperature, and I'll show you a trick. So this is the test. For those of you who have never made a Besciamella sauce before, we do what's called the spoon test to see if it's thick enough. Now I'm going around and stirring and incorporating everything from the bottom right into the middle, and you pull your spoon up and you just do this. And if that line stays, then you know it's done. So that's it. Once it reaches that consistency, our Besciamella sauce is ready to be put onto our baked pasta dish. So now our Bolognese sauce has finished simmering. You can tell how much it's reduced because the level has gone down to about a quarter of its original volume, and all of the flavors are just condensed and really beautiful. The final touch is to add in a cup of milk. So just regular milk that goes in, and this is going to make the sauce really creamy. And normally, if you were doing this step, you would just let it cook about 10 more minutes or until about the sauce is kind of ready to be made. And so when your ragu alla bolognese or your bolognese sauce gets to be about this consistency, it's exactly the perfect texture for putting on your pasta. So you can use it to dress any of your favorite pastas and bring it immediately to the table. But today we're going to use it to make our baked rigatoni al forno. So next we're going to boil up our pasta. I'm using rigatoni today. I like to use the rigatoni because they have the little ridges in them and they're nice and tubular, and they're very traditional when you make baked pastas in Italy to use this shape. It's also super easy to find. Those little ridges really help to grab onto the sauces. But if you didn't want to use rigatoni, you could use ziti, penne, farfalle, what are called bow ties in America. Really any kind of short pasta that has a little bit of something to hold onto the sauce. So I've got my pasta water at a roaring boil, and I'm going to add in a nice handful of salt. I just want to add the salt once the pasta water is already boiling. Then I'm going to add in my pasta. So now we're going to keep this at a boil. I'm just stirring to make sure that none of the pasta sticks together. But keep it at a pretty high heat and let it continue to cook. I would stop cooking this pasta about a minute to 2 minutes before the package directions, or as I like to say, a minute before al dente. Normally we cook the pasta until it's al dente and then serve it with the sauce. But because this is going to get cooked again in the oven, it's going to get a little bit mushy if you leave it at that level. So I would cook it until it's really just almost ready to eat, but still too tough. That's going to be your perfect consistency to make the baked pasta. So now we're ready to assemble our rigatoni al forno. And if you were at home, this would probably go into a Pyrex type of a dish, a glass dish or a ceramic dish. With using our ovens, we can use a cast iron skillet. So if you wanted to do a big one, you could use a large cast iron skillet like this. But I thought it would be fun to do individual serving sizes. So we're going to use these little guys, and that way everybody gets their own portion. It looks really cute and special. It takes a regular dish and elevates it. So I've buttered the bottom of the little cast iron skillets, and the first step is to give them a layer of the bechamel sauce right in the bottom. And it doesn't matter for this recipe if the bechamel sauce has already been cooled or if it's, a little bit warm or you've just made it. You just want to make sure that you get a nice coat on the bottom of each one of these dishes. Of course, if you wanted to, you could just toss this into the pasta, add your favorite vegetable, and just bake it right away, but we're going to do it this way. And then I think I'm going to add a little bit in right into my pasta just to coat it, give it a little bit more flavor. Sometimes I don't do this step, so it's optional, but why not? Then I'm just going to put these right into the top of each skillet. Now I'm going to sprinkle each one with a little bit of Parmigiano Reggiano. You could use pecorino or whatever your favorite grated cheese is, but I like to use the Parmigiano because this recipe has a lot of milk in it, and so it's dairy, cow milk, and then to finish with the Parmigiano cheese, it's also a cow milk cheese. It's going to give us a great flavor and just kind of amp up the same base that we have in the rest of these dishes. Before it goes in, a little drizzle of olive oil, and we're ready for the oven. But if you wanted to make these in advance, you could set these up even a day in advance and bake them off right before serving. So it's a really great dish to be able to use for holidays or whenever you have to get ready in advance. So here we have our rigatoni al forno. This is a great recipe to make for special occasions or anytime you just want to make things a little bit different and more exciting. We made our Besciamella sauce, our ragu alla Bolognese, and then our final dish. And for more information and to check out more recipes, visit our blog.